Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Saturday Secrets of Eventide stream. I am the creator of the Eventide setting, and I may have had a little something to do with Pathfinder. I'm Jason Bullman, and today, what I'd like to talk about, I've got kind of an interesting topic today. It's a bit of a challenge, and it's something that's ongoing for me and my creation of this world, and that is a discussion about the peoples and cultures of Eventide. It's a big topic. It's got a lot of moving parts, and frankly, getting it right is a big, tricky thing. So I'm looking forward to chatting with all of you about that. Now, before we get to that, I have some exciting updates. Things are coming along on the first part of Wolfran's Fate. It is in the hands of an editor as we speak, and the additional art pieces I need to kind of wrap it up are in creation. I've seen sketches. Those of you who are Lord tier in the special Discord chat, I've posted up some of the sketches of some of those final pieces I need to kind of wrap this this bad boy up. And if all goes according to plan, the whole thing, the first part of Wolfran's Fate may release as a 32-page PDF within a few weeks. We're getting real close. Which means, frankly, everybody who can see this stream will be getting that PDF for free. So I'm thinking it's probably going to be somewhere between around a $15 price point. And that'll be something that all of you get for free. I may even do a little bit of a discount to drop it during Gen Con for those not going to the show, because the folks at the show aren't going to know that it's happening, and I'll make the coupon code, the coupon price, available only during the days of Gen Con. So maybe some folks who are there may realize it and hop on and get it, but they get to pay full price the next week. So that is coming together nicely. I am super excited about it. I've ordered up some very exciting art pieces. I have a headshot of the Major Domo. I have a headshot of Lieutenant Havanok, who ends up being kind of the main member of the Blue Banners that the PCs end up interacting with. And I ordered a spot illustration of the big tapestry in the elevator room. And I saw a sketch for that, and it is fantastic. I'm super excited about it. And then on top of that, I have a half-pager that I ordered to serve kind of as the cover. I think each individual quarter is going to have its own half-page cover. Then when I lay out the giant kind of Wolfran's Fate super book, that's probably going to be 140, 160 pages, right? You know, when I lay that out and put it together, those half-pagers will then become interior art, and it'll have its own cover. So, yeah. It's coming together nicely. It's almost like, we're making real projects in progress here. And it's all thanks to you. Honestly, this art and layout stuff is pretty expensive. And, grand total here, I think I've dropped about $4,000 on art and layout. Now, some of that art's for the player's guide and some other stuff. So, there's a lot of moving pieces in here. But frankly, if it wasn't for the support of Patreon, I don't know that I could do this. It's a lot of money, and but it's worth it, because if we get it right, this could be a big thing. So that's kind of where we're at. That's the update for all of you fine backers. Let's hop into this discussion about the peoples and cultures of Eventide. Now, what am I talking about here? Obviously, I've talked about some of the various nations of Eventide, or city-states. Allnear has, obviously, Zankar right in the middle. You have the northern free cities. You have the kind of southern band below Zankar that's mostly small city-states and free cities. Arguably, the goblins and their folk and Crownbog control kind of the southern tip of the continent. And then, you've got some free cities heading out to the west, and eventually you end up in kind of pirate lands and some things like that. So, we obviously have a number of kind of interesting locations and nations and rulers and stuff like that. But that's actually not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is something far more granular than that. The people. What are the people like? What are their cultures like? How does that map to the world? And, it is such a critical topic because I do honestly feel like getting peoples and cultures to feel real, to feel lived in, to feel like they're an important texture in the world, is a real trick. And honestly, it's something that I feel like a lot of campaign settings don't really get right. I think a lot of traditional fantasy campaign settings take kind of there's an easy route you can kind of take on this, and I'm guilty of it as anybody, where you kind of map some real world cultures over, at least in some light ways. I mean, think about how many campaign settings have Vikings, right? That is just a common thing. And it's based on the fact that fantasy as a genre has a lot of very easy kind of pickups, that you can say, oh, it's just like Vikings. And everybody kind of groks it, even if it's dwarves. Oh, it's dwarven Vikings. Oh, okay, sure. And it's just this kind of cultural language that I think a lot of campaign settings rely upon to kind of get across vast swaths of information very easily. Now, I understand that drive. I'm even tempted by it at times, but I actually think it comes with a number of problems, a number of challenges that make it, honestly, something that I'm actually actively trying to avoid with even. Now, ultimately, like in a lot of classic RPGs, and I put Galarian in this camp, but Forgotten Realms certainly, and Greyhawk absolutely. You end up with these very large kind of monocultures, right? Where it's like, oh, you're from Dental Keep, or you're from, Galt, or you're from, Greyhawk, right? And, no matter which one of these things you do, I guess Greyhawk's actually kind of a bad example because that is the one place that is actually kind of split up, but you're from, Burundi. I think a lot of these things are very large monocultures where they're defined by their national borders, and it's like, oh, on this side of this dotted line, people are like the French, in the case of Galt, in a constant state of revolution. But the moment you cross that border from them into Taldor, and all of a sudden it's more like collapsing old Empire land. And I think culturally that comes with some challenges, because that's not really how the real world works. That's not how people experience culture in the real world. And it honestly also leads to this kind of overly simplistic morality being painted on things. I think back to Zental Keep, and it's like, oh yeah, that's a place where everyone's evil. Oh, we're going down to Zirnikanen or Menzoberranzan, or your underworld places, and those also evil. And honestly, I think that is frankly a bad idea. Because cultures are not easily painted with a moralistic brush. I think you can say there are trends within a culture, but I don't believe that those things are trapped within dotted lines, and that's how they work. And frankly, as I'll go into here soon, it also can lead to some pretty problematic traps. So the second part of that is when you start mapping real-world cultures onto a fantasy setting. I honestly think History from Our World kind of comes along for the ride. There's no way around it, right? The moment you start saying there are Vikings, that means, there is a culture of people who go raiding other cultures of people. That's not the worst example in the world, but frankly, you can end up in a lot of places where you're dragging in elements of some pretty terrible stuff, right? It's kind of hard to do stories that involve, like, Renaissance era England and France and stuff without dragging elements of colonialism into your stories, which is not great, right? These places sailed around the world, set up shop, said that they owned the place, drove the local populace out, or worse, enslaved them, or made war against them, displaced people, took over lands. It's an ugly bit of real world human history that frankly you may not want dragged into your fantasy world, right? You know, I think some of that stuff, frankly, comes with some baggage that's too heavy to bear and not something that you may want to explore in your world. Now, that's not to say you can't, you know, intentionally set up, hey, everybody, we're going to do a story about, you know, fighting back against colonial invaders. I think that's a perfectly fine story to create if everyone at the table is on board and understands what it is and, you know, is there to experience that story and explore that space. But I do think it's dangerous from a campaign meta setting level to just cram that stuff in and expect everyone to accept it and like it. Because not everyone will. Because when you take all of that together, when you start taking, you know, broadly based monocultures painted with kind of moralistic simple brushes and then tack on real world historical baggage to it, I think you end up in some spots where there are plenty of folks who, when they approach your campaign setting and look at that kind of stuff, they're not interested in that, right? You know, that's some of that has obviously very big knock-on effects on our cultures today. And for some people, those things are real. Those things live in their world, and they must deal with it on a continuing basis. You know, I'm a white dude. I don't experience a lot of that, but I am aware of it. And I do try and understand that my stories can have impacts on, you know, folks who have been oppressed, who are from marginalized communities. And I need to make sure that when I'm talking about my world, I'm not creating echoes that make them uncomfortable, that make them deal with things that they don't want to deal with inside of the fantasy role-playing setting. And the thing is, right, I don't want to say that anyone who has done that sort of work in the past has done so necessarily with malicious intent. It's an easy button to press. I get how you end up pressing that button, that you're just trying to create a common kind of easy lingua franca between everyone at the table. You're trying to create a shared zeitgeist of a fantasy world and saying, yep, there are Vikings, is simple and an easy way. Oh, there is an Egypt land, right? You know, that is their culture. They have pyramids and wear sandals. But the moment you start dragging those things in, it brings in elements of slavery. It brings in elements of colonialism. It brings in elements of, you know, some pretty terrible parts of human history. And those things can then get added to your world in a way that you maybe didn't want or didn't intend, or, you know, are just kind of bleeding into stories where you didn't mean them to. So, you know, even if it is unintentional, it was still your choice, right? So when it comes to building Eventide, I'm trying to very intentionally take kind of a different tact. So let me go into that. That's kind of the setup. That's the dangers of just kind of doing quick cultural mapping, right? Because there was a period of time where when that didn't exist, when I didn't have a better understanding of peoples and cultures, there was some kind of just broad-based painting that was just like, yes, this will do for now. But as I'm going along, these things are becoming more and more nuanced. And honestly, this isn't something that's going to suddenly snap into place overnight. It's an ongoing design challenge for the world. So here is my approach to creating a world with rich cultures and broad-based peoples. So I'm going to start. Step one is to create base cultural groups from starting regions and peoples with influence. You can get more granular on this, and I do think it's important that as you go along, you get more granular. But, you know, when you're looking at a map of the whole world, you got to look at things that are going to have bigger impact on that than something that's like, in this valley, there is one specific cultural group. I think you can get there. As a matter of fact, I do get there, but to start, I'm not there. And, you know, so in this case, I start identifying base cultural groups. So obviously Zankar, you know, is a region. But even within Zankar, I can identify multiple cultural groups, right? So you've got obviously the old Zankarans. They're the ones mostly based out of Skyhammer and the surrounding environments. This is the old seat of Zankar power. And, you know, this is where Zankar has been for the longest period of time. And frankly, that is one very specific culture. Now, if you dove into that city and did a specific breakdown, you could obviously start subdividing it out even further. But for our purposes right now, you've got Zankar culture is broken up into several different groups. You've got the kind of old Zankar, you've got elements of new Zankar, folks who have been added to the empire, and they come with their own different flavors of that. So that's like a cultural group with different fans of cultures within it. And then you've got kind of like the middle term, the folks who are nice, settled countryside Zankar citizens, right? And they are by no means monolithic, but again, for the purposes of a world map, you could kind of group them together to some extent. But you go on beyond that, right? You got Helenanthus, which I'm going to talk about in detail here in a bit. That's the homeland of the halflings, and one of the places where this method is most easily displayed. So I'm going to talk about Helenanthus here in a bit. You've got the human diaspora, right? Because humans originally came from a continent on the other side of the planet where they mostly fled after a kind of catastrophe about 1,200 years ago. And the humans have kind of spread all over the planet, and some went up north over, the pole and came down in Alnir, and they're the ones who settled up in the northern free cities, and eventually came south and formed Zankar. But then you have all of the humans that fled from the southern part of that doomed continent, and they fled by the sea to various different places and have settled and created entirely new cultures. So you've got various elements of the human diaspora all over the world. You've got the cultures of the dwarven city-states, which frankly now have collapsed down to the point where their culture is fading away and is frankly now kind of really broken and fractured. But the best way to build that is to start from where it was originally as kind of a dominant influence on Alnir, and then just reduce it down. It's like you're setting the transparency down to 20%, right? Because there's just not much of it left. The same goes for the Elven collectives. You have all of the swamp dwellers and swamp cities to the south, and they probably share similar cultural elements just based on their environment. You've got I mentioned them before, but you have the Ruby Road free cities up north, which are some very different cultures. Honestly, you've got Varnathus, which is the kind of proud, independent, powerful free city to the west. And far to the east, you have Tusktown, which is kind of a wild west, in that it's mostly just one small settlement that everyone uses for protection, but it's mostly hunters and traders. But again, even when I say something like Wild West, I'm bringing world cultural things into it. So, again, even now, it's easy to fall into those traps. So, and then, obviously you have Wormbone in the middle, which is kind of a mix of both of those. City, independent city governed state, but also kind of a wild territory where they don't control the whole region, and their area of influence is pretty limited, but their power in the region is undeniable. So create, the first steps in this is creating these base cultural groups, and then divide them. Step 2 is taking those cultural groups and understanding that they themselves are broken up into other distinct cultures. And in some cases, these are going to be cultures that are tied more closely to ethnicity, and in other places they're not. And frankly, that just depends on their location and kind of history and their how broad of a city are they? How diverse is this culture? Because there are cultures in the world that are more diverse than others. And sometimes that's just based on geography. And, so Helenanthus is overwhelmingly halfling, but that doesn't mean it's all halfling, right? In fact, if you go to some of the major cities in Helenanthus, there are plenty of other people there who are in the Helenanthus cultural groups who live with that as their culture, even though they are not halflings. So, let me actually break that down. So Helenanthus is the one that I think is the most kind of interesting to talk about here on its base. So Helenanthus is an island. It's a volcanic island continent, actually, far to the west. It's actually, now that I think about it, it's actually part of another continent. That's fine. Helenanthus is a very large island to the west of Alnir, and out across the Irdi Ocean. And Helenanthus is a volcanic island, and it's covered with halflings. It is overpopulated with halflings. Halflings in Eventide have very large families and have lots of kids. So as a result, there's just a lot of halflings on the island. And as a result, there are 3 distinct cultural groups. There is the kind of oldest cultural group, which is the seafaring, shore-dwelling halfling culture. And they have, they are the kind of OG halflings. They've lived on the shores for as long as there were halflings on Helenanthus, and they make their lives and live their trades on the ocean. And they, all of their towns and cultural centers are along the coast and on islands. These halflings, they're the ones that have they use like knotted rope as a form of writing. So, they will leave a line of knotted rope, and the way the knots are tied and the distance and spacing between them can form messages. So they can leave a message on a buoy just by the rope attached to it. OG halflings, yeah. So there's those, and they are no longer the most populous culture on Helenanthus, but they are the oldest. The next is probably the most populous, which is the kind of the rural dwelling halflings. These are in smaller cities, smaller enclaves on farms, living in the forests of Helenanthus, which I believe are temperate jungles temperate rainforests to the north, and tropical rainforests to the south, because Helenanthus is really long. They therefore would be subdivided up into the temperate rural halfling culture versus the tropical rural halfling culture. They would share a lot of similarities, but they would be different in many ways. And then finally you have the most powerful and influential of them, which is the capital and city dwelling halfling folk, who obviously have traditions that are tied to those other groups, right? So, but as their own cultural elements, right? This is the halfling nobility, the leaders of the halfling nation, mostly belong to this culture. So here you go. You've got 3 distinct cultural groups. I can do the same thing with the north, right? You have the northern free cities in Alnir. So you have Varnathus, which is the kind of powerful, learned tradesfolk. It's a little steampunky because their city is on a series of hot springs and stuff. So it's a steam heated town, and is kind of a learned place, a place of kind of winter fashion, and it is still a place of learning, of magic, and is kind of a metropolitan, one of the greater metropolitan places in the free world. And it avoids kind of being absorbed by Zankar because of 2 things. One, its power, and 2, 4 or 5 months out of the year, its harbor is ice, and only they have the ships capable of breaking through that ice and coming and going, making it very hard to assault the city from the water. And over land, it's a very long journey. So that is Varnathus culture. Then you've got on the opposite side, you have Tustown, which again is a bunch of hunters and traders living in kind of a pretty wild frontier kind of place, that is frankly relatively barren, and they, unlike Varnathis, end up icebound for parts of the year. And that is just part of how their society works. And then, you get to, frankly, the Icescar Valley culture, which is where Wormbone is located, and you can divide that up, and in fact I do, into multiple different smaller cultures. But as a whole, it's marked by kind of rugged individualism, folks who still believe in magic but are frankly a little afraid of it, people who value their independence and their hard work, above all else, but, still come together as a community to survive what is frankly a pretty unforgiving environment, filled with wild creatures and terrible weather for portions of the year. So, dividing, and again, you can divide that even further down into, you've got the free farms, which is a bunch of kind of outsider, xenophobic, untrusting of folks who live in their own small community in the shadows of the mountain with the big hook. You've got Wormbone. Obviously, this is perhaps the biggest outpost of the primary cultural influence. But you also have places like Red Thistle, which are less about individualism and more about collective effort, because they have to be, and they're ranchers and cattle folk out to the east. So, and that doesn't even touch, like, the smattering of dwarves who are still in the region, much of which are just part of the Wormbone culture, but there are some who are camped near Rhymeshield, who frankly would probably be a different old bit of dwarven diaspora, who are still trying to live in those old dwarven ways based on the dwarven fortress that be up there. So, all right. So step 1, create broad cultural groups. Step 2, divide those cultural groups up into digestible, understandable pieces that, frankly, you can start assigning cultural traits to. So, for example, the seafaring halfling culture. Well, what do we know about them? There's lots of fishermen. They travel by boat. They have a form of communication that involves knotted ropes. They, frankly, probably have a lot of products and rituals based on, the sea and the oceans, and, so they're a maritime society. So you can start picking up elements of, what do maritime societies typically do? What do they look like? What are some of their rituals? And you can start inventing things along those ways. Now, this is the point where you get to such level of granularity that I do think grabbing some amounts of small real-world cultural elements might be interesting, right? Do the seafaring halflings like to use shells and stuff in their clothing, in their hair, and their decorations? Yes, why wouldn't they? They're seafaring. Almost every seafaring culture in our world follows along those traits. So you can start kind of creating interesting groups based on their location, their lifestyle, the peoples that live there, and kind of start creating this package, right? Because what you're doing is you're trying to create something that you can label and say, this is a cultural group. But you're not done yet. I don't think you are. I think the next step is to take those groups as kind of, and you might, personally for me, I also fade back in time to do some foundational work, like to say, oh, this is what the dwarves used to look like, this is what the elves used to look like, and be able to kind of chart some of these things through time and say, oh, Zankar as a cultural group, as a kingdom, only appeared, around 0 TD, right? It was a dozen years into the current reckoning, and they were nascent at that point in time, and you can then start taking these groups and expand them around the world, right? So let's take those halflings, for example. The halflings from Helenanthus are some of the same halflings bringing their own culture with them to Belcrash, which is a city in southern Alnir. So the halflings, suffering from extreme overpopulation, have been, frankly, sailing around the world looking for uninhabited places to make a home. And they found one in Alnir and settled in the region of Belcrash. There was no one there. It wasn't driving anyone out. They just landed ships there and started making a home for themselves. And that takes elements of the halfling cultural maps and brings them over to this region. So you now have Helenanthus halfling cultural groups, and frankly, it's starting with mostly the seafaring halflings, because they would have been the first ones to get there. But then is rapidly also including the nobility group. Their cultural group also comes there because they want a bigger influence, and that's how you end up getting the King of Wideland, and understanding how that maps. So you've got Belcrash, which has city-dwelling halflings, and you still have the shores around it, which is, and the city itself, which is filled with the ocean sailing halflings, and you might even start getting some of that third group as well. Now, what does all of this mean? Well, as you start expanding these influences and peoples and kind of putting them all over the place, and understanding how these cultural and people influences move around the world, you can basically kind of start creating like what I'm currently calling a heat map. And you're basically saying this culture has a strong influence here versus this culture does not have a strong influence. And these things with these blooms will overlap one another based on geography, spread, right? And other, kind of borders and other things will limit or expand these sorts of things. And how those change over time will expand them as well. I mean, anyone who's ever, visited, frankly, anywhere in the world, but this is especially true when you visit some places in Europe where it's like, oh, this place is both French and German, because the border has moved back and forth 15 times, and these two cultures are both all over the place here. Because that, again, this gets back to one of my problems in that cultures are painted with kind of nationalistic dots on a line brush, and that's just not how things work. So if you start doing that, you start understanding that Belcrash isn't a monolithic halfling culture, and neither is any location on Helenanthus. Now, they may be stronger in halfling culture, but Helenanthus is on the same continent with Zankar, and the rural Zankaran cultural map definitely expands over Belcrash. And there are humans living in Belcrash who bring with them the kind of Zankaran way in life, or other cultural groups from the southern nation states of Alnir. So what I'm doing is creating kind of a rich tapestry of peoples, right? So Varnathus, we talked about them. Varnathus is not just Varnathus culture. It's just not. And I wouldn't even end up calling it Varnathus culture. But it is a broad tableau of the peoples who call Varnathus home. And while the vast majority of them are of their kind of regional culture, that is by no means universal and should never be viewed as such. It also, therefore, prevents one culture's attitudes or morals being the universal norm. I don't like that in my settings, where you can approach a peoples and just be like, well, they're all evil, so if we have to kill some, well. It should never be that black and white. It should always be kind of a complex issue. It should be a complex question of, yes, there are bad people. There are bad people in Wormbone. Plenty of them. But does that mean Wormbone is a city of evil people where you can just kill whoever you want? No, of course not. And the same goes true for Zankar. You may think Zankar as a government is pretty vile and does some pretty detestable things. But the average person in Zankar, are they evil? No. Most of them are just trying to live their lives, raise their families, feed their kids, and be prosperous. And that's what I want it to be. I don't want, heroes and groups viewing Zankar as just open field for murder and mayhem. Despite the fact that that is most player characters' only mode of operation. But I do think that that is, you know, a good goal when it comes to campaign building, is to avoid grabbing large cultural stereotypes and tropes and just broadly applying them. I think it is interesting to say, yeah, are there people, you know, let's take a different issue. You know, are there peoples in Eventide who practice mummification? Yes. Are they culturally identical to the people who practice mummification in our world? No. No, nor should they be. They can be different. Do they have to live in the desert? No. And frankly, mummification is also practiced in plenty of places that are not just Egypt, but Egypt is the place we know the most about, just because of our education system being lazy at times, and, you know, painting in broad brushes. But I do think, you know, there's opportunities here to kind of break the mold on some of this stuff. And don't get me wrong, I think, you know, a lot of campaigns do this kind of work. I'm not saying that I'm the one who's invented this, not by any means. But I do think that for me, it's really important that Eventide as a setting be a place with a broad, diverse approach to culture. And the same goes, by the way, to ethnicity. I'm not tying characters' ethnicity to their ancestry. It's not like humans are the only folks who have various ethnicities. There are plenty of ethnicities in the world, and just like culture, it's about determining ethnicities based upon region and history, and then mapping that to the world and allowing it to spread as people move around, as migrations happen, you know, because frankly, the world is filled with opportunities for migration and trade and conflict and just exploration, right? Because this isn't the sort of world where, you know, every inch of it is populated by humanoids. There are plenty of untamed wild places, and some of them may have had people in them at one point in time, especially with the collapse of various populations due to the change in the way magic works in the world. Certainly some of that stuff has changed over time. But when you look at ethnicities, I want, you know, it's like, oh, okay, so this is, you know, this is ethnicity that comes from, like, you know, a northern hemisphere kind of thing. And, you know, obviously I think you end up with some, you know, these are some pretty pale looking humans because they don't get a lot of sun and they spend a lot of time in the winters. And yeah, the halflings can be that way too. The same goes for, you know, more melanistic expressions from tropical environments and things like that. I think all of that applies. You can be a halfling from those places just as well as you can be a human from those places, and your ethnicity, you might share an ethnicity with them. That's not how it works in our world, but I don't believe that in a fantasy world I have to be bound by those sorts of conventions, because I do think the world is richer for allowing folks to see themselves in it, no matter what their culture or their ethnicity is. And in some cases, that's finding the right home for it, but in other cases, it's just allowing it to exist and encouraging it to be a part of the world of Eventide. So that's where I'm going. That's a lot, and there's a lot there to think about, and it's a work in progress, right? I'm not going to pretend that I have all of this right, and frankly, there's probably going to be some points down the road where I ask some cultural sensitivity readers to go through the world and just help me check my biases, right? You know, I'm a product of, you know, the American education system, and with that comes some baggage. You know, some things that I work hard to learn around, and I don't always get it right. And I certainly haven't in the past, right? I mean, if you look at some of the things I designed in Galarian, there are some of those things that we've changed over time because they weren't a great take even, you know, when they first were put into the world. And, you know, I'm excited and embracing those sorts of changes. When it comes to Eventide, I'm going to learn the best I can and do the best I can. And then, you know, we'll continue to learn and grow with it. That's kind of the most I can ask for out of myself. So, you know, that's where we're at. If folks have any questions, I probably have a minute or two for questions before I have to back out of this one to get ready for my next stream. But yeah, it's a complex challenge. And frankly, this also speaks to, you know, there's a similar question and similar concepts about some of the ancestors in the world. Like, I think these are bigger picture, but, you know, I'm still trying to work out a good through-line narrative for orcs that isn't tied to some of their baggage and how they're portrayed in other settings. You know, so there's some challenges there. I think, you know, I want a world with orcs and goblins and dwarves and all those sorts of things, but some of them have been tied to some pretty heinous stereotypes. You know, drow and, geez, you know, some of that stuff is just filled with challenges and things you have to kind of unpack and do better, just to make your world a better place. And a place that's more open and engaging to everyone to sit down and enjoy. That's what I'm trying to do. It's an ongoing process, and one that I think ultimately I'm made the richer for, and so is the world. So that's what I got here today, folks. I think if we're not seeing any questions here in chat, I may just wrap this one up a hair early. Give myself an extra minute to go grab a snack before my upcoming stream. So I want to thank you all for stopping by here today. The next stream will be this coming Tuesday. There will be an Eventide stream. I'm not sure what we're going to be talking about. Probably more stuff for part 2 of Wolfran's Fate. Maybe if I have a few final art pieces, I'll show a few off to the massive folks who show up for that. As this thing continues to come together nicely, I want to thank you all for watching, and thank you all for your support. I really couldn't do this without you. And so, yeah, thank you, and we will see you next time.